Hi, we're here to talk about business debt hibernation. We've got Damien Grant and Brent Norling. This is the formal business debt hibernation regime that the government introduced recently as a result of COVID-19. It's here to support business owners who are suffering liquidity problems due to COVID-19. Damien, do you want to kick off and tell us about the regime and who qualifies?
So the legislation, before we talk about what debt hibernation is, the question is, does the business qualify? And there are a couple of prerequisites. The first one is the business must have been solvent on the 31st of December 2019. And they're defining solvency in this case as being able to pay the debts as they fall due. So that doesn't mean solvency in the traditional solvency test that we're familiar with in the Companies Act, the infamous two-limbed test. So you can be balance sheet insolvent, which means that you might owe your bank or shareholders large amounts of money, but if that's not a due debt, what matters is can you pay your debts as they fall due. So typically you would look at your current assets and your current liabilities. And so long as you can meet your current liabilities at the 31st of December 2019, then that's the first step. The second step is that your insolvency, so presumably you would only go through this if you are unable to pay your due debts, that must be as a result of COVID-19. So, and look, they don't really define exactly what happens there, but let's say you're a business and you might be a tourism or hospitality. You may not be affected by the virus, but you're affected by the economic impact of the virus. So I think in those situations, absolutely, that's what the law is designed to capture. You'll be covered. And then by September next year, you must be solvent again. So there must be, what they're looking for is saying, we're looking for companies that are experiencing temporary cash flow problems as a result of the economic uncertainty, and that's what the law is designed for.
Which is quite hard, right? I mean, for business owners to be able to, most business owners that I deal with find it very difficult to be able to forecast to September 2021, especially in times like this.
And it's worse because you actually need to sign a statutory declaration to those effects. So you must sign, and lying on a statutory declaration is perjury. It's not usually enforced, but that doesn't change the fact that if you lie on the statutory declaration, it's a crime. So before the company can enter in the debt hibernation regime, 80% of the directors must sign that, must fill in that statutory declaration that the company was solvent at the end of last year, is currently insolvent as a result of COVID-19, is going to be solvent at some point in the near future. So that's a pretty big requirement, and the law is there to protect those companies that fall into that criteria. So Brent, you meet those criteria, how do you actually go from the directors have signed the resolution, how do they actually enter debt hibernation?
Yeah, so the first stage is what they've labelled an entry notice. So you need to complete the entry notice, you need to send it to the company's office, and then we need to serve that on creditors. And the entry notice broadly sets out what the proposal will be. It's not all the detail, but it's a high level of the proposal. It tells creditors how they're going to be able to vote on the proposal and all the relevant timeframes. And
so how many of the directors need to vote for this thing? Yeah,
so that comes into the certification. So there's 80% of directors need to agree to this. But in the notice stage, it's just advising your creditors of what you're planning on doing. And then once that's entered at the company's office, the company has 1 month where it's protected from any enforcement of their debts.
What about can the bank appoint a receiver during that time?
No.
That's pretty harsh. So if I have lent money to a company and I've got a GSA over the company, and if the company defaults, I have the right to appoint a receiver. Once the company the directors have signed the resolution and they've given the entry notice into the company's office, I can't put that company into receivership.
Yeah, it's everything. All action is stayed during this period, right?
That's outrageous.
It even goes back. So any action that has commenced prior to the notice, that has a stay of enforcement during the period as well. So theoretically, if you're a creditor and you're enforcing your debt, you're trying to liquidate the company, it's possible to get a stay of enforcement on that pending the outcome of this process.
So I begin enforcement action against my debtor, and then in 3 days after that, the debtor then enters debt hibernation. Then my enforcement procedure is nullified at that point, or at least stayed.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk briefly about a quick example on this. So the theory of it is you do entry notice and all enforcement is stayed. But we did a case recently in the High Court where it's exactly what the debtor tried to do. So they gave us no notice. They turned up, same day.
This company had actually entered debt hibernation.
Yeah,
at least nominally.
It had given the notice to the Companies Office 2 weeks prior to the liquidation being called at the High Court, but it hadn't given notice to us as creditors. And so it was effectively an attempted ambush where they're saying, well, hello, we've got hibernation going on, so you can't liquidate the company. And we actually managed to convince the High Court just to liquidate the company because the onus is on the debtor company to prove that it has complied with the regulations, but in this case they hadn't discharged their onus. And
so what specific areas did they fall down on?
Well, to get into the regime, you need to give a certification. The directors need to give a certification that one of the certifications is that there's liquidity problems that are as a result of COVID-19. And in this case, we're saying...
And the case you're talking about, because I know the case, there was no way that company was solvent to the 31st of December last year.
Well, that's the thing, right? Every single one of the certifications would have been a lie because these debts were outstanding well before December 2019.
So that's really important. So if a debtor company wants to obtain the benefit of debt hibernation, it is not sufficient to simply sign the stat demands, the declaration and send it to the Companies Office. The directors must be telling the truth, and the burden of proof sits on the debtor company.
Yep.
So if your company is grossly insolvent, was insolvent at the 31st of December last year, and then you try and gain the protection of debt hibernation, court's not going to be interested.
No, not in this case. I mean, it might be a judge-by-judge situation. Some judges are a little bit more debtor-friendly than others,
and this case wasn't in Auckland, so
it was in Wellington.
We didn't have the issue that we're both aware of. Okay, all right. The debtor company meets the criteria. The directors have filled in the statutory declaration. 80% of the directors have signed the director's resolution, and the notice has been uploaded onto the Companies Office. So debt hibernation is now officially kicked off. What does the board now do in terms of what's known as the proposal?
Yeah, so there needs to be a proposal made to creditors which sets out the full plan. So it's under this regime, the company is able to basically park its debts for 6 months, and they're going to have to pay them all at some point, but they can kick the can down the road. All this plan needs to be in there, and I think this is probably the most crucial part of the process. So when the board is putting together the proposal, they need to really stop and consider what the purpose of their document is and make sure that they're persuading their creditors that this is the best outcome. They need to persuade their creditors that they should hibernate the debts for 6 months versus the alternatives.
Because it's a two-step process, isn't it? The first step is the creditors don't really need to be consulted or involved. The board comes in, signs the statutory declaration, and instigates, put this thing happen. But that only lasts for 1 month. And then the board puts a proposal to the creditors, and then how do the creditors exercise their say over this thing? Yeah,
so my approach on this would be, cards are on the table. So if you want to persuade your creditors to compromise with you, you need to put your cards on the table. So that involves, putting some financial information on the table, show them what a liquidation would look like. So if we can't do a deal and we can't compromise and we're forced to liquidate, what is it going to look like? So the liquidator gets appointed, what's the likely recovery for creditors going to be? And we know in a lot of liquidations that number is 0. You're surprised.
I'm
Not in your liquidations.
I
in your
am
liquidations.
shocked. Okay, so the board says to the creditors, right, here's our financials, here's what's going to happen in a liquidation. They send out the notice, and the notice must say who can vote, what's the implications of not voting, what's the implication of voting. Right? So how many of the creditors need to support this proposal before it becomes binding?
The majority, yeah.
By dollar value, by number, by what?
So it's a majority in number and value. So if you got 10 creditors, you need 6 creditors to support it. If you got $10 of debt, you need $6 of.
So you need so you got 10 creditors. You need a majority in both the total number of creditors and the total amount of debt.
Yeah.
Okay. So I got a company. My brother's creditor for $100,000. Can I rely on his vote to get this thing over the line?
Well, part of the proposal actually needs to appoint a decision maker. So it's going to administer the proposal, and it's going to make certain decisions on counting votes and assessing the validity of creditor claims. And unfortunately, unless the court approves, related parties are out.
So my brother Brendan can't vote. He's owed $100,000. I need his vote to get this thing over the line, but he's out.
Well, we're just going
That's harsh.
We're just going to have to rely on our persuasive skills. And look, and I think that comes down to how you actually present the proposal, right? So you don't have to have a meeting. You don't have to have a meeting with creditors.
You can do it by poster vote.
Yeah, you can do this on the papers, but I think for a
you could
lot
do
of
an explanatory video.
You could, but I think for a lot of cases actually, it's going to be important for directors to front up and actually go through a process and take their creditors on a journey and to persuade them that this is the win-win for us all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're right, because what you're asking the creditors to do. So in the proposal, there's a bit of flexibility, but nowhere near as much flexibility as, say, in the Part 14 compromise or in the voluntary administration. Here, you can't actually compromise the debt in terms of forgiveness. So if you owe the creditor $1,000, the most generous provision you can give yourself is, I'll pay you that $1,000 in 6 months' time. I would think that that's going to be a hard proposal to get over the line for the creditors. You might want to say, I'll pay you $100 a month for 6 months, and then I'll pay you the $400 at the end, or something like that. Yep. So you've got to give the creditors some choices.
Yeah.
And you've got to give the creditors a reason to vote for it, but you also should let the creditors know what happens if this compromise, if this proposal fails, because the company goes into liquidation, you're in trouble. Okay, but I just want to come back and talk about that first month. So the entry notice has gone into the company's office. The bank can't appoint a receiver. Can the photocopier guy come and pull up his photocopier once the entry notice has been issued?
Yes. No, you can't. No.
No, it's outrageous. It's outrageous.
No, you can't.
So, and in fact, once the proposal has been voted on, if the proposal passes, fails, or the end of that first month, then the bank or whoever else has got a GSA can appoint a receiver at the end of that month. But the photocopier guy, he's actually locked out for the entire 6-7 months of this thing.
But there's some exceptions, right? So if the security is over, say, perishable goods, then they can come and take their assets. Yeah, it just depends on the type.
A photocopy is perishable?
No, but is the ink?
That's a good point. The ink could occur off. What about
probably not.
What about magazines? Are magazines perishable?
I think they can be.
Yeah, I think a magazine is perishable.
Yeah, there's issue dates.
What about a McDonald's hamburger?
Well, it depends, right? So it may become less edible, but I don't think it's perishable.
No, I think those things go on forever.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, just in summary, so debt hibernation applies in a relatively limited set of circumstances. It applies to companies that were solvent, are insolvent as a result of COVID-19, and are going to get back to solvency. And it is a means by which limited liability companies who have a future but just needs some cash flow relief, it can get that. And this regime provides that, and provides a limited degree of protection from your creditors while you work through this issue. Probably isn't going to work for most of the people that we see. I think we both agree that the compromise with creditors, the liquidation hive down, and even dare we say it, voluntary administration, is probably going to be better for most companies, because in that situation you can actually take your total amount of debt and shrink it, whereas this implies that the total amount of debt must ultimately be repaid, which in the current environment I think is a bit hard.
I think just one message that I want to get across is communication through this process is absolutely crucial, because if you surprise it on people and then you're less than forthcoming with information, you're just going to frustrate your creditors. It's very much cards on the table, open communication, and you just need to be persuasive through that process.
And that can be hard for a lot of people going through insolvency. Right, Brent, you've got something on your website to talk about this issue?
Yep.
So do you want to show the camera what it is?
Well, I've only got the black and white version with me.
It's still good though.
I got this eBook on the website. It's free. We'll put the link below. It goes through all of the formalities of the business hibernation regime, and also a bunch of alternatives in there as to how to hibernate more informally, so dealing with the lease, the staff, all that kind of stuff.
So this isn't just about the debt hibernation regime. This is about more generally how companies under stress can actually hibernate. And it's quite clever, because you came up with that proposal, that name, before they came up with the debt hibernation thing.
Week 1 of lockdown.
Always one step ahead. And at Waterstone, we've got a small booklet as well. This booklet is only talking about the formal process of debt hibernation. So we don't get into, because at Waterstone we're an insolvency firm, we don't pretend to offer more general advice. We just deal with insolvent companies, and Mr. Norling's practice offers more innovative solutions. We're just a hammer looking for nails.
Hey, if you go to a dentist, you're going to get recommended a root canal.
Whereas you've got the entire toolbox. All right, thanks so much for watching. The links and other materials will be down below. Thanks.